So today on the Bold Move podcast, we get to sit down with Leo Porras, who is a legend, and like probably the most humble legend, honestly.
Know about that.
I do. In the world of training and, in particular, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. But your history with training has gone for decades, and you have such a predominant name here in Washington State. You mentioned your name to just about every law enforcement officer that went through an academy before 2016, and they know exactly who you are and are probably terrified of you. But yeah, so thank you so much. We're here at Matrix Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, which is your new gym.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful facility. You guys have done a ton of work here.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And so we'll definitely dive into that. But thank you, man. Thank you for being.
I appreciate you. I mean, we worked together at the academy so many years ago, and then to see where you've gone and what you've done, I mean, that's amazing to me too. So I'm humbled. It's a privilege to be able to just sit here and talk with you, and I'm looking forward to it.
That's awesome, bro. Well, cool. So you are obviously a black belt in jiu-jitsu.
Yes.
But you didn't start out a black belt in jiu-jitsu. So
none of us do.
No. So how did you come to wanting to be involved in martial arts?
Well, I wrestled through high school and dabbled a little bit like in your traditional martial arts, which is great. And then just by happenstance, there was a guy at my church that I found out was pretty high level as far as in combatives and training, a guy named Eric Cobb, very well known in the combative space. And he had some friends down at the academy. And I asked him, I was talking to him at church one day, and I asked him, hey, is there any way I might be able to learn some things from you? And that's actually how I got introduced to the academy.
Oh, wow.
So we went down there to train one day. I didn't know a whole lot about anything, but he knew Gary Drake, Don Gula, who were down there at the academy at the time. And from that friendship, from that association, was actually how I started to dabble in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu.
Really?
Because if you remember, they had a wrestling down at the academy that was part of the curriculum, but then they had that open mat on Tuesdays. And so that became, that Tuesday became a very important Tuesday. I would always go down, and I would always roll around with Drake and Gula and all the guys that were down at the academy at that time. So that was really my introduction to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And that's from there, it just grew to where it is now.
Sure.
Okay.
Around what year is that?
Oh man, I'm dating myself. I'm going to feel old here. That was actually back in 2004.
Wow. Okay.
Back in the day.
20 years ago.
Yeah.
Holy smokes.
I know.
That's insane. I mean, when I first started doing stuff, it was 2007. And so you had already been doing it for a while.
That's when you and I met. That's right. Wow.
So, and this is kind of what's unique and maybe unique about our podcast, but prior to that, you weren't involved in law enforcement. That's
not at all.
Not something that you had on the radar.
Not at all.
And I mean, if I recall, so correct me, please, but I think you did some work in insurance stuff, or remind me.
No, I was just a regular guy. I was doing computer stuff, analyst type of work, marketing work at that time. And then I would go down to the academy and train with you guys.
Yeah.
And I had a little bit of freedom as far as some of the work that I was doing. So I could go down there during the days, like when we were doing scenes, those type of things. So that's why I was able to go down there.
Okay, that's awesome. So you go down, you work your full day, then you said, hey, I'm going to go have some fun and do some mat work. When did you start going to like a belted program at a specific gym, or did you start doing that with the Drakes and Gulas, or?
So that's a really interesting part of my jiu-jitsu, which I think like even people that train with me probably don't know, but it took me 5 years to get my blue belt. And you and I were just talking about that.
Yeah.
Okay. So from 2004 to 2009, my training was actually just the academy. Wow. I would go in there one day a week. And I think during that time, I might have had a handful of actual classes. Okay. Brad Conway was down there at the time. And so like he was one of my main training partners, and he was under Marcelo Alonso, who absolutely love and adore Marcelo, one of the big gyms, one of the foundations of jiu-jitsu here in Washington. But I'd gone to a couple of classes there at Marcelo's, and then I would float around to a few other places, but I actually didn't formally train anywhere. And one day when I was at Marcelo's, he's like, hey, I see you at the tournaments and I coach you and I see what you're doing. And like, we need to give you your blue belt. And that's actually how I got my blue belt.
That's awesome.
So that was how I got there. And I still was kind of floating around until about 2011. I moved to Tennessee for my job.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And there was a gym there, Brentwood Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, which has now changed their names to Perfectus. Great gym in Tennessee. I consider those guys family. And I started actually training there as a blue belt for the first time, taking classes, formal classes in the gi. And that was the first time that I actually went on a regular basis to do Brazilian Jiu Jitsu.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
That's interesting. I mean, my path is kind of similar. I mean, we did a lot of stuff, we did a lot of ground stuff on those mats, but it was never really formalized. It wasn't a program that necessarily built on each other. Like, it wasn't thought out. We just really kind of beat the crap out of each other.
That would be the correct way to say it, 100%.
And it took me forever to get my blue belt too. And I'm sure it's going to take me forever to get my purple belt too, because work gets in the way.
Sure,
life gets in the way. You just have to prioritize, but you're doing a lot of travel, it pulls that away. But that's so cool that it almost took taking yourself out of that element of where you're comfortable here, going to a different state, and then being able to dive into that time and make that a repetition and keep that going. That's fantastic.
Well, I will say, I mean, Gary Drake, Don Gula, well known in the training space, and so they were great training partners to have. Yeah. They're a wrestling program, can't say enough about that. And then just people coming through the academy like yourself, Brad Conway, other people that knew jiu-jitsu. So I did get some good training there. It just wasn't formal, like you said. We really would just come in there and just beat the crap out of each other.
Yeah.
That's
but we learned. I mean, that's the
we
thing.
Did.
Is, we did. We were being trained. We probably just didn't know it.
Yes. Not for the faint of heart, probably the way that we did it, but here we are, and it worked for us.
That's right, man. So you start training at the academy on Tuesday nights. At what point did they start having you integrate in teaching?
So that was interesting too. One night they were short a role player, and I remember they asked me if I'd be interested in being a role player. And to be frank, I really didn't know what that meant. They just said, oh, hey, you're going to put this suit on and these guys are going to try to arrest you. And that's, that was pretty much, and maybe my memory is failing me, but I don't remember there being, plus I think it was Brad Conway who was telling me about it, right?
Yeah, there wasn't really a formal introduction to what that was. And to your point, when we were done, we still didn't know what we were doing. We just experienced something.
For sure. I mean, looking back on it, because of the type of activity it was, because of the high physical contact, there should have been probably a little bit more of a preparation.
But
literally, they just threw me in this room, and here I am mixing it up with 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people who are trying to arrest me, and I look back at it, and please know, I didn't really know what we were doing. So it was just fun to me at the time.
Yeah, it was a blast.
I thought everybody was having fun, and I didn't realize that they were testing or that this was part of the curriculum that was really stressful. I had no idea. I was just in there like, oh, hey, everyone's having a good time.
Yeah.
And it took me a week or two to realize, people are really stressed out about this.
We're here, they're here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And just to give some context for some of the listeners, we would have scenarios that were designed for us to lose, right? The goal was for us to lose, but we didn't really figure that last part out until maybe a couple years into doing it, because really our goal was, let's show them how much they don't know.
Yes.
And that's the part that I'm not super proud of, because
times were different.
Yes, for sure. they learned by experience. And what we would do, I mean, man, there'd be times where our goal would, before they would enter the room, would say, hey, we're going to handcuff this guy, right?
Yeah.
That we would do. Hey, we're going to tie this dude's shoes, together while we're rolling with him.
Yes.
And we would just do these things. We'd have a yard sale. Their gear would be all over the place.
Yep.
We'd be wearing their belts,
Yep.
It'd be a whole thing. And, there's a certain point of stress inoculation, which I hate that term, but there's also, we want to make sure that we're giving them enough tools so when they walk away, they can actually do what we're asking them to do.
Sure.
Otherwise, we're just being jerks, and that's what we did for a period of time. But it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, but I do think there was a lot of benefit because some of the folks that went through the academy, and even now, probably even more so now, some hadn't even been in a fight.
Right.
And so I think if nothing else, just people being aware that bad things could happen in those type of situations. And the good part was, generally speaking, that was a very safe environment for them to find out, like, wow, things could really go south if I'm not aware and if I'm not prepared. So I think there was still a great benefit there, even though, it might have got a little wild at times.
It was a good time. But yeah, I mean, here's the scary thing is we had dudes like Pat Gilbert, who's 8'2" and 700 pounds,
Gentle giant.
Yeah, exactly. He really is. But they come into a room and they see, oh, it's Leo. You're pretty unassuming. You're not super tall. They're like, I got this.
Not
this is
super
fine.
tall.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Being polite. But I would imagine that you surprised several people going into that scenario.
I heard that a lot. And again, I was very unassuming, not on purpose. I just thought we were having a good time, and it was just there to, help people just work through the scenario, really. And I did hear that from people like, man, you're so unassuming, but it's just kind of my personality, I guess. Like I'm just a regular guy doing regular things, So, and I still run into people today, and I have to chuckle because they're like, man, I remember you, and man, you beat up a bunch of people in my class. And I'm like, hey, it wasn't personal. We were just doing a job. And everyone's always very gracious, but I just kind of have to laugh and go, that wasn't trying to be mean. That's just what we did. Right.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things prior to me starting to role play, actually, I think I got that in reverse order. So I role played before I started being a monitor because they wanted to have some intelligent critiques, and probably not able to do that unless you've done the job.
Yeah.
And so I remember being a monitor after the fact, and we'd call the scene, and you'd switch from being this like frothing at the mouth maniac who just ripped them to shreds to be like, okay, so here's where it went wrong, and just having that mentality because you're the nicest dude ever. That's the one thing.
Thank you.
If you ask people to describe Leo, he's the nicest dude ever.
Oh,
right?
I appreciate that.
And that's a pretty cool thing to have as a reputation. But in those scenarios, it caught people off guard. They're huffing and puffing, right? They're like, oh my God, what just happened to me? Where's my gun? But then to have you just kind of break things down in a way that really made sense was incredible experience for them. But it's also incredible because you had zero law enforcement background.
Yeah, very true. But I also think, when it comes to those type of conflicts, altercations, some of it is common sense.
Sure.
Right. And I think at the end of the day, everybody wants to go home to their family.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't think you need some high like IQ to figure out, hey, like if you want to go home to your family, these are probably some things you should do. And these are probably some things that you shouldn't do. And as far as the acting part, I look back and I laugh because you were a role player.
Yeah.
Right. And I think acting like the crazy person is the easy part. I think it's acting normal around other normal people. Like that's the hard part for me, right? Because we're weird people, right? Let's admit it, right? We're probably not the most normal people you'll ever meet. So anyways, I think that's kind of entertaining in my mind.
It is because you get to be kind of weird. And honestly, coming from the law enforcement world, I think I learned more being a role player than I ever learned in any formalized class. You might see the same thing because you took a lot of those skills that we learned and transferred it over to jiu-jitsu or any other type of self-defense stuff. But I learned, movement. I learned angles. I learned all that simply because I'm trying to find the angle of how I'm going to punch this cop in the face, right? Like, how do I be successful as the bad guy? And then being able to turn that back around and figure out, okay, how do I not let the bad guy be successful in those things? Man, I learned a ton of things. It was just a great time doing that. So
I would agree. That was probably some of the best training I've ever had because it was high stress for everyone involved. And you did recognize how people move when they're under stress. They tend to do a lot of the same things. All the pre-attack indicators that I'm sure you teach and get taught, you see all of that. And like you and I were just talking about a little bit before this, is the number one skill we learned was like how to not get injured.
Right.
Because I'm sure you got thrown through a few walls.
Oh yeah.
I got thrown through a lot of walls, and then they also replaced a lot of that furniture with soft furniture because
Eventually.
because of the injuries. And if you look at mock seating now, I haven't seen it for a little bit, but now they've padded all those walls. Well, that would have been nice when we were role players, right?
Yeah.
That would have been nice. Maybe not break through that drywall.
When drywall isn't padding,
right? So yeah, in that sense, it was some of the best training because it was relatively safe, but still high stress and high physical contact.
Yeah. I think one of the coolest things that we got inherently out of that is the repetition, right?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned 10 people earlier, but really, I went back and I did the math. You'd have a class of 30, sometimes 32, and we would do a high and a low scene, and we'd take 15 on a high scene and 15 on a low scene. So really, we're coming in, and within 4 hours, we're rolling 30 times at different levels.
It's a lot of fighting.
Yeah, man.
It's a lot of fighting.
Yeah.
So.
And so that repetition was really beneficial because you can say, okay, I tried it this way and have an immediate redo and then have an immediate redo after that.
Right.
And just really rounding out a lot of the skill set. Not like we were trying to beat them up eventually.
No, but I think when you say repetition, again, people tend to do a lot of the same things.
Yeah.
So, that helps us recognize that type of movement and to keep them safe and ourselves safe. And I'm sure as law enforcement, you're trying to do the same, out on the street or, in the prisons and the jails.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's, you don't always get those redos, in the field there.
You don't.
And thank God for that.
Right.
But I'll tell you when you go back to your agency after the academy and you have opportunities to train with your resident DT instructor, they only have so much time there too, because they're dealing with like a 4-hour block, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year if you're lucky, And so if you don't take a ton of information out of that small period of time, you're just not going to get it unless you find it somewhere else.
That's, again, I feel like that's that 4 hours is tough to get a lot of information out of that, because I think the repetition does help with your muscle memory so that when you're out there, you don't have to think about it. It's just muscle memory. It's a natural reaction rather than what do I do next year? I forget.
Right.
So.
Right. And that's just it. So how long did you spend training at the academy?
I was there. Well, we started 2004, and then I was in Tennessee for a year, and then I went back and was training and being a role player and doing some instruction there till about 2016.
Okay. Awesome.
So, about 12 years.
Did you ever do anything outside of academy training? I mean, because I know you were working through your BJJ stuff and all that. Did you ever do any self-defense stuff?
Yeah, I did. So we actually, me and a couple friends, led by Eric Cobb, we actually had a combatives company that did more training as far as real street fights, real life scenarios, violence in that capacity. And so we did for a few years, we did those type of classes to civilians and into companies as well. And that was actually a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But combatives is tough because it's hard to rep.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a valuable skill to have, but fights happen on the street much different than they do like in competition or sport. Violence happens a lot different than what people would imagine. And I think like you being on the street, you seeing it in the cells, you can speak to that as well. It's not what you see in the movies for sure. And so trying to replicate that and build a program around that can be a little challenging at times, but it was a great experience.
Yeah. Yeah. How did you find your students change from academy cadets to civilians? What was the biggest difference there?
Well, so are you saying how did I find students for the other company that we were running?
Well, no, when I say find, like how was their perspective different than somebody going into law enforcement? Because
that's a great question.
Be honest, because there's a lot of the cops that we deal with. Like 2 weeks ago, they were a barista, and now they're in an academy uniform trying to do their best. You know,
right? That's a great question, because the perspectives are different now. As my assumption is now, as a law enforcement officer, somebody's going to be in law enforcement, you have a goal, or you have a directive, at least internally, that you should probably learn this.
Yeah.
Okay, if you want to be safe and come home to your family. When we were doing training on our own, it was people who were looking to be safer, to have self-defense, for a lot of the same reasons. But I think that is that's not the majority, right? It's people who are a little bit more aware. They want to have some tools in case things go bad. Whereas like law enforcement, they're like, that's going to be part of their job. These other folks coming from the civilian side, like they're around there, maybe they had some experience, or maybe there's just, to be frank, maybe there's just some fear that they want to sort of reconcile and make peace with, if that makes sense.
So their end goals are different, right?
Yes, and I think the motivation's different, right? Because again, in law enforcement, it's part of your job. You're gonna get into some scraps where, for us out there, you walk in the Target, I know you probably do this, right? But you look around and you think there's so many people that are just unaware. Like if I wanted to just grab this person's purse, I could do that. Or you see people on their phone, and then there's that very small percentage that are aware that bad things could happen.
Right.
And not that you want to. I talk about this when we're doing some of our classes. It's like when you're teaching a child to cross the street, you don't want them to be paranoid when they come to the curb, like, oh my God, every car is going to hit me. You want them to have an acceptable level of awareness. Right. And so that's all we were trying to teach. And some people who realize that, hey, I need to have some awareness and this is the acceptable level. I think that's the right thing, right? We don't need to be paranoid that something bad's going to happen every time we walk out of our house. If we have an acceptable level of awareness, then we don't need to worry about it as much.
Sure. And I mean, we saw the gamut of that, right? If you look at Cooper's color codes there of alertness, right? I'm butchering the name, but we had a lot of people that were in condition white. They had no idea what was going on, just happy-go-lucky, thrilled to be alive, right? And bless those people, because the world needs that, I guess. But you have your yellow, which is somewhat aware. Get into your orange, where you're kind of hyper. If you're in your red all the time, to your point, dude, you're going to gas out. And you're going to start missing things, and you're going to start having way too much hypersensitivity to stuff. But then we also see people that went straight to condition black. I remember one time where it was just a very, very low level scene where I was supposed to get arrested. They grabbed my arm, and I just pulled my arm away. And that was a wrap, man. They just started hit me in the head as much as they could. This dude did the people's elbow onto the couch. There's elbow no padding up there. Oh, yeah. And they had to take him off, and his eyes were this big, ready to rock and roll. And so it's man, I know that at the time we were getting a lot of people that were just fresh out of the military, and so there's a lot of things that people are combating with that. My heart goes out to those guys.
Absolutely.
But we also have, like you said, an acceptable level of awareness, and we don't get to lose that just because somebody pulls their arm away from you.
Right.
And that's probably the biggest thing when it comes to that, is when we're dealing with civilians, there's not really a requirement to be cognizant enough to turn up the heat and then also pull it back. Whereas in law enforcement, it's not just a requirement, it's a law, right? We have to use proportional force. So being a civilian is actually a lot easier because the rules are really focused on your skill base.
Yeah. Well, would you say you could almost justify it more as a civilian because you haven't been said these are your rules?
That's right.
I look at what you do as far as through ARC and just some of the conversations just that we've just recently had. And when I look at, and it's easy to criticize. I understand that. I'm not trying to be that person, but some people, they only have one tool. And when stress happens, like if all they have is a hammer, they're just going to start using that hammer with more and more force. And what I love about what you're doing is you give people more tools. Like sometimes a hammer isn't the tool for the job.
Right.
And you through what you're doing, you give them more tools, acceptable tools to get the job done, whether it's a screwdriver or it's a wrench. But if all you have is a hammer, you're going to hammer at a screw or, use something that you shouldn't use.
Sure.
So, I think that's kind of what we do is we give people tools so that they can be at that acceptable level of force.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how many times did we hear when we were rolling at the academy? It's like, man, I just shoot you.
Yeah.
Well, okay, but
don't say that out too loud, Tim.
I'm excited to have your house later. There's so many things wrong with that, but I'll tell you, going back to my agency, we had a huge emphasis on firearms stuff there. And we might do 2 hours of DT, which turned into, okay, we're just going to handcuff people for 2 hours because people don't want to roll around. They don't want to do anything productive. And if you look at hey, if all you have is a hammer, well, we're investing 90% of our energy into firearms. How does that translate when something goes high stress, right? You go
That's a good example.
black, they're going to start shooting.
That's a good example.
And I remember a specific circumstance where we were doing some brace contact stuff, Don and Gary's brace contact, and my firearms guys were so against it because it was outside of their comfort zone. They didn't like it. There's so many different things. They said, yeah, I'm just going to shoot him. I'm not going to need to have it defended. I'm like, well, maybe, but probably not, and it's just a hard thing to get around because guns are cool. I get it. I get it. So very cool. So you did some self-defense stuff and all the while you're back here from Tennessee. How is your culture difference there? Because I've been to Tennessee quite a bit. It's different.
That's an understatement. And I met some great people in Tennessee, but it definitely was different. So I can remember we moved into a very nice neighborhood in Tennessee, and one of the things that was weird to me is actually I was out there mowing the lawn, and a neighbor walked across the lawn with, I think, a pie or something to welcome us to the neighborhood. That was the weird, because I grew up in White Center. Yeah. If somebody walks across your yard in White Center, they're not there to give you a pie.
You're drawing it low ready, yeah.
Right, yeah. Or okay, I guess we're fighting.
Yeah.
Right. And there's definitely some more racial tones that exists there.
Sure.
Never bothered me, but I did see it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's just because it's the South. I really, but it was very recognizable. Again, it never really bothered me, but there was definitely some differences in culture. People were very polite, though. That's the Southern way. And by and large, though, I really enjoyed the people. I still have some great friends out in Tennessee. I was only there for a year before I moved back here, but definitely a different culture. I think one of the things that shocked me the most is my girls were in soccer. And so we go out for our first game, and the refs had everybody gather in prayer before the first game.
No kidding.
Yes. And I'm from Washington, right?
We had one guy do that at a football game here, and he had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get his job back.
There you go. And I was thinking, you guys can't do this. But that happened so many times, and I thought it was great. I thought it was great. But, again, there's definitely some differences.
Yeah, for sure. One of our biggest relationships that we've developed is through the Tennessee Correctional Institute. We've gone out there, I think, a total of 12 times to go teach different things, and just love the people from there. Some great food there too. So we're hoping to come back, but there is a bit of a difference. And they're really trying to get their people up to speed down there, which is awesome. So
I have this is kind of off topic, but I want to ask you this. Okay, so I have a good friend in Tennessee. We did jiu-jitsu together. We were kind of rivals, and a great guy, but he worked in the corrections as well. And he said something to me that was very interesting. He goes, I always knew I was going to be in the jail. I just didn't know what side I was going to be on. And I thought that was a fascinating comment. And since you work in corrections, I'm just curious, like, what are your thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the cool things that corrections has to offer, different from the road, is camaraderie. And I know that our patrol counterparts have camaraderie.
Oh, sure.
But if they're having a bad day, if they have a bad interaction with somebody, they get to go into their car, they get to go drive away, and then they get to be by themselves until the next call comes up. In the jails, we don't get to go away. You know what I mean? Like, we have to solve our stuff, and we have to work with one another. And that's why one of our predominant classes that we teach down there is our team tactics class, because backup's pretty close. We have that option. But the reason why I point that out is that people that are seeking tribe or seeking camaraderie, you can find that out on the streets. You can find that in the bars. You can find that in those different areas, or you can find it within the walls as an officer, being able to work on a team and be part of something bigger than yourself, And so I think that's probably where those lines intersect.
Sure.
But I've definitely worked with some people. It's like, wow, if you were to put a uniform on, or a jail uniform, I wouldn't be shocked,
Interesting.
I've done some training, all over the country. We did training in Illinois, just south of Chicago. And the way those folks talked and the way those folks operated, you could not tell the difference between them and an inmate.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They were all,
interesting.
It was all gangs. It just depended on what kind of clothes that they were wearing. So,
well, now that comment makes it always made sense to me. It was just really interesting, the delineation.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I just didn't know what side I was going to be on. So, and he was a savage dude. That's for sure. Great guy though.
That's
great
awesome.
Guy. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many good people that work in the jails, and that's kind of why we've dedicated our role to supporting our folks there. But also the people, like, we have listeners and relationships with people that have been in jail and now are on the other side. And we want to cultivate that too, because that's the whole goal, right? Is you go into corrections with the idea to self-improve and come out better. It's that simple. You should be going into a career or going into an academy, going into training to come out the other side better, right?
Yes.
And so the goal is to kind of model that, to help people kind of get on the same wagon, go on the same path.
Sure.
And you meet some pretty cool people that have been inside those bars. So
yeah. Well, I mean, I think even in the general population, let's say it's uncommon that you find people that have that type of awareness and are actually seeking to better themselves on a continuous basis. So when you find them in any part of life, right, it's always nice to meet those people.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. That's where the like-mindedness comes in,
Yes.
There's so many times people just go through life and are, I don't want to say satisfied, because that's not necessarily a bad thing, but they are very comfortable. And one of the common themes on our show here is that you can be uncomfortable but safe, but no growth comes out of comfort, right? You're stuck. And I think there's a lot of folks that are working the job that are comfortable and they want to stay that way, but they've done the job for 22 years and they look back on their career, they've not done anything, They're still the same person.
Well, I think for a lot of people, they may have done the job for 22 years, but that doesn't necessarily mean 22 years of growth.
Right.
It might have just been the same job 22 times.
That's exactly right.
I think that's, and you and I talked about this a little bit beforehand, as far as, people growing and putting themselves in situations where they're uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But I think after high school, a lot of people do get complacent because I think we go through the most change. Like we're always being forced to change as we're going through school. Like there's new teachers. If you're playing a sport, there might be new coaches, new teammates. I mean, it's a time of constant change. And I think as adults, we don't, unless we are the catalyst for that, or life changes, you lose a job or, circumstances change. Like a lot of times we do get comfortable and we don't force ourselves to push.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking with the owner of Tenacore Holsters the other day, and he's going to be on the podcast. But one of the things he mentioned is how do you force that change? You talked about being the catalyst to that. And it's so easy just to not do that, so easy just to be like, I'm going to go back to my chair now.
Right.
But the way to get out of there is not just to look at the grandiose change, but it's more to like focus on little micro steps.
Mm-hmm.
Like what is the next little thing that I can do? Try, fail, try again, and that was a big revelation for me because, when we first started our company, I was still in law enforcement and we didn't make big moves or bold moves, a little plug for that. But we did stuff like we'd reach out to an agency and ask them if they wanted a free training session. And they said yes. So we went and got our name out. That simple, low risk, but high reward in the long term, right? And just making those little baby steps. Maybe that step is, hey, I'm going to call this jiu-jitsu gym and I'm going to see if I can do a free trial. I'm not committing to anything.
Right.
I'm going to give it a shot, right? And just those little things. I'm going to go for a walk today. I'm not going to run a marathon. I'm going to go for a walk around the block, Just super important to keep doing that. Otherwise, that's why people get depressed. That's why they have all these other issues. So,
there's so many similarities, I think, and you and I were talking about that before this podcast. Yeah. But, one of the great quotes that I just heard recently was, you're not the goal isn't to be perfect in the end. It's just to be better today.
Yeah.
And like people look at, let's say, jiu-jitsu and think it's hard. I don't think jiu-jitsu is hard. I think change is hard.
Yeah.
Right. Walking through the doors the first time, for somebody who's new to jiu-jitsu, I think is a really difficult thing. Mm-hmm. You walk into an unfamiliar environment to people you don't know, and on top of that, you're going to do a combat sport. Well, kudos to you for taking that leap.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's, but again, if we don't push ourselves, we can get complacent, and I think that's where a lot of the struggles people have is they're just bored. They're mentally bored and mentally complacent.
Yeah. One of the things that you hear a lot is, the two hardest days of jiu-jitsu is your first day and then your second day. Being able to experience that discomfort and then just doing it again, And I think for me, I really didn't have that because I knew what I was getting myself into when I first started doing jiu-jitsu because I had been a master DT instructor for a long time already. And then did a lot of ground stuff, but nothing formalized, kind of like you.
Sure.
But when I went for my first class, people assumed that I had no skills whatsoever, which wasn't the case, But I'm still a blue belt, and I'm working through the programs and doing different things, looking at different gyms and training at different places. But being able to stick that out, I think, is really, really difficult as well. So kind of going back to your journey, you get your blue belt in Tennessee, right?
Yes.
And then you come back here, and who are you training with? What does that look like?
Well, I came back here, and it was a tough time. It was a very difficult time. The plan wasn't to come back to Washington, but as life has it, there were a couple of my brother died unexpectedly. My brother's son died unexpectedly a couple months later.
Oh my goodness.
I was going through a divorce, and then my father died all within a year.
Oh
so
it
was a really difficult time. Like I wasn't doing any training.
Yeah.
I was still flying back to Tennessee for my job. They allowed me to work remote. And so while I was there, I think I was going back maybe once a month for a few days, and I would pop into Brentwood Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, which is Perfectus now. And so from about 2012 to 2013, that's what I was doing.
Wow.
And then I was still working at the academy when I could.
Sure, yeah.
And so I would go there. So that was, I guess you could call that training. And I think the big thing that happened there was, with all these things that were happening in life, I decided, I'm going to go and do the Master Worlds competition as a blue belt. Just to say, hey, I competed at a world championship one time. Hadn't competed for a year and walked in as a nobody and ended up winning it.
No way.
So, and that was a pretty cool deal, actually.
I bet you needed that during that time for sure.
I didn't really know. I was just there to participate. I did not know where I was going to end up. And of course, it's a great feather in my cap. And I think it's a great testament to, the guys at Brentwood Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and Perfectus who are helping me get ready for that. But it's a big feather in my cap. And then they gave me my purple belt on the podium.
No way.
Okay. That was 2013. And then because of life, didn't train for 2 more years.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
So, I would drop it. I was still at the academy. I'd drop in there once in a while, but wasn't anywhere formal. And then a good friend that I work with at the academy, a guy named Tom, and I forget his last name.
Tom Clark, maybe?
Yes, yeah. Tom Clark.
Oh, yeah. Shout out to Tom
Clark. Great guy. We always laughed, had a good time. I worked with him at the academy a few times, kept telling me, hey, you should come out to Phantom Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. They're great guys. And he, kept telling me, hey, you should come out. Went out to Phantom. It was 40 minutes from where I lived. There's a bunch of jiu-jitsu skills in between there and then, but I found a home there. So, Bingo Crook and all the guys, a great academy. I think one of the things that's really appealing, or one of the foundations, is they are such a welcoming gym. And that you could say that of all the James Foster gyms. They're all very welcoming. I've traveled the world and I've dropped into gyms here and there, like Hong Kong, Germany, really? Sweden, all across the United States. And I'll just say there's some gyms that aren't as welcoming as others. Right. You go in, you're like, it's gonna be a long day on the mats, right?
I know where I stand here.
That's thrashed. For sure. Yeah. I don't think they want me here, but but I went into Phantom and found a tribe, and just great folks, great training partners, and that's where I ended up getting my black belt. So that's kind of how my jiu-jitsu journey went. And then from there, I was already training 4 nights a week. I was teaching at Phantom, and I thought, maybe it's time to go ahead and open my own gym and extend the benefits that I found, into another community. Yeah. So that's where we're at now.
There you are. And I'm probably stepping in it, so my apologies, but do you have a normal day job, or is this what you're doing 100%?
This is what I'm doing 100% of my time. And, like you made that transition, and it's a scary thing for sure. Yeah. But when you work at something that you don't care about, because I was doing like data analyst work behind a computer. When you work at something you don't care about, that's stress. Yeah. Right. When you work at something that you care about, that's passion. And I see that with what you're doing. And even though I'm here quite a bit, it's because I enjoy it. I enjoy Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's not the same as doing something that I don't really care about.
Sure. Yeah. So, well, when you're pursuing your purpose, I was talking about this the other day. Purpose really is built of 2 components. It's aptitude, like you got to be proficient and good at it, right? But you also have to want to be doing. You have to have enthusiasm as well. When you have both of those things, then you have purpose. And there's so many people out there that are just doing what they're doing to get by, be able to pay their cable bill, and if you gave them an option, if you said, hey, money is not a problem, what would you want to do with your life? People don't even have an answer for that question because it's so unfathomable. but what you've built here, and you guys just opened probably like a month ago, maybe
3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago.
This is week number 3.
Dude,
so we're in the thick of it. Yeah, we are in the thick of it.
You have so I showed up and you had a pretty fat homeschool class here.
Yep.
Lots of different energy levels. People are so excited to be here. And just, I got an opportunity to kind of observe. And one of the things that I really appreciate, I kind of missed about you, was your ability to deal with people that are stressed out. Even the kids, like the stress of just doing this is there, but they might even not be performing the way that they should be, or they are distracted. Your way of dealing with people is so kind.
I appreciate that.
But you're also able to redirect them, right? Because I've been to gyms where, like, if a kid who is like high energy starts looking at the door or something like that, they get barked at. And there's a space for that too.
Sure, there's some discipline. Right?
For sure, there has to be. But I also know that, hey, when I was a kid and I got barked at, learning stopped there, right? That was it. That's all I needed to know. And so I just really appreciate your ability to coach. And there is discipline here. I loved how you had them, slap and bump, make sure they understood everything, make sure that they acknowledged, yes, coach, that type of thing. But you also gave them the freedom to train and have fun while still pushing them a little bit. So it's super cool.
Well, I'm glad you came a little early.
Yeah,
so
man, it was good to see you.
I do appreciate that.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about what got you to make this move. You said you were training at not Foster's, but at
Phantom.
Yeah. And then were you still working your normal job then? Or?
I was.
Okay.
I was still working my normal job, and then decided to open this up.
How do you make that decision? Like what?
That's the same way you made your decision.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes, sometimes circumstances forces your hand.
Sure.
When you do that. But I think that there's so many benefits that I've seen from people being on the mat.
Yeah.
And when you're passionate about something, it's easy work to a certain degree. It's still work, but it's easy work.
Yeah.
But it's definitely scary.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely scary. And like you and I were talking about, if you could have seen when you started ARC, if you could have seen where you are now, if you could have seen that when you first started, things would have been different, right?
Oh, easy.
You would have been
if I knew where we were going to land, absolutely, right. Yeah.
And that's obviously what I'm hoping to do here. And we've got great support from the other gyms, where we've had people in every class. So in that sense, it's been great.
That's awesome.
But fingers crossed, that we grow the way that we're projecting.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, look, it would be impossible. I will put my name on it. It would be impossible for somebody to come here and train under you and not only have great jiu-jitsu, but have a life-changing experience.
I appreciate that.
Well,
I appreciate that.
Just being associated with you at the academy and seeing the people that still come up to you and talk to you, that's what you do. That's your superpower. And you can't do that sitting behind a computer, man. So.
Hey, you know what? That means a lot to me. Yeah. So I do appreciate that. I think it's something that I talk about in my classes. I think one of the reasons why people really get into the jiu-jitsu life is because if you look at kids, and I was just doing another interview and I talked about this, but I believe it wholeheartedly. If you look at kids, one of the reasons they're so happy is because they live in the moment.
Right.
Like they're not thinking about yesterday, they're not thinking about tomorrow, and they live in the moment. Where like as we get older, as we become adults, we beat ourselves up over the things that we failed at, right? Mm-hmm. Even a few years ago. And then we're worried about the things that we may or may not be able to accomplish tomorrow or the next day. And so it's hard for us as adults to live in the moment.
Sure.
And I think that when people come into jiu-jitsu for that hour and a half, they are forced to live in the moment. Someone's trying to choke you, but at that moment, right, you're forced to be present. And I think what that does is it allows your mind to get a rest. Mm-hmm. Get a rest from really all these things that you can't actually control at that particular time. And so even though you're physically tired and exhausted, you're mentally refreshed, and now you can go back to those other things and maybe have a less stressful perspective about it.
Right.
And so I think that's, one of the great benefits, and not just jiu-jitsu, but if people can find that in other workouts. But I do think particularly jiu-jitsu really makes people live in that present moment so that they can mentally refresh themselves.
Absolutely. That should be your tagline. Come rest at Matrix Brazilian Jiu Jitsu.
Yeah, while we're trying to break your arm,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, don't worry about it. It's fine. No, man, that's such a good message, because life isn't getting any easier, right? With all the craziness going on in the political world, and how expensive things are going, and everybody's work is just, people aren't working anymore, so overtime is off the hook. People need a home where they feel comfortable with, but keeps them out of the comfort zone so that they can continue to push. And I think that's the biggest thing here.
Without a doubt. I think I was just talking to Justin, who's the owner of Nova Ryu Jiu-Jitsu down in Tacoma. Great club, by the way. And, he has 20 years in jiu-jitsu as well. And I asked him, I said, even after your 20 years, do you feel like when you come into your gym, there's still things that push you, force you to grow, make you look at yourself, even after 20 years? And he said, absolutely. And I still feel the same way.
Sure.
I mean, even as a blue belt and a purple belt, we all have those days where we left the gym and we're like, I don't ever want to come back. Like, I got my butt kicked and I don't even know why I'm doing this. Well, I got news for y'all. It happens at black belt as well, right? And that's because jiu-jitsu is a sport that will constantly push you. It's constantly going to force you to grow no matter what belt level you are. And as a new person come in, a lot of people will find out, hey, I'm a lot tougher physically than I thought I was. I'm a lot tougher mentally than I thought I was. And it forces you to grow, even if it's just that one guy that keeps getting you, in the triangle.
Yeah.
Right? It still forces you to grow.
Yeah.
So I think those are some major benefits, because no matter what you do, whether it's this or even corrections, like, people are fighting battles that nobody has any clue that they're fighting. And then you talk about that community, like, it's good to know there's other people that are fighting those same battles, because sometimes you don't know.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why people get really depressed. They think they're the only ones.
Yeah.
And so when you kind of find that community, it really helps you to just be refreshed and be able to go out there and keep fighting whatever battle is that you have to fight.
I love that, man. It's such a powerful message. I can't think of a better way to end that. So that's awesome. Well, man, thank you so much. I think what we'll do is in our show notes, I'll get a link to your website and some of your other stuff there so that people could find you. But Matrix Brazilian Jiu Jitsu in Auburn, it's the place to go. The facility's amazing, by the way. The mats are fantastic. You guys did a lot of good work here. And come train.
Hey, I really appreciate your time. I know, life took us a few different directions, and I'm really glad we got a chance to connect. I'm really honored that you asked me to be on this podcast. So thank you so much, Tim.
Thanks, man.
All right.
Appreciate you.
Yeah.
All right.